Hola, mi amigos. This is Laura coming to you live from a coffee shop somewhere in downtown Toronto. Undisclosed location, if you will, which adds to my mystery and mystique, making me a much more interesting person to listen to via podcast. So please enjoy what I have to say regarding 3 different curators and their speeches in 2005 on July 16th in Banff. The first talk was by Jan Allen, called Speaking Through Silence. She speaks of the nature of the curatorial authority, flow gates lip reading, thoughts on the limits of articulation. Oh, and I'm going to repeat myself and say the nature of curatorial authority again, because that seemed to be a very important point. She's a great speaker from my point of view, with very little interruptions, although there is a big computer screen blocking her face, which is a little bit annoying. She shows an interesting clip entitled 2 minutes and 50 seconds of silence for the USA, which was made in 2003. It's a clip of 2 minutes and 50 seconds of total silence during a speech which Bush gave. Allen argues it's an act of scrutiny, these 2 minutes and 50 seconds of silence on this speech on the war in Iraq. And commercials on air are wanting to buy silence for profit, and she speaks about the importance of having silence and the importance of silence in curation and letting the work or the artifact speak for itself. Is silence staged for certain emphasis, or is it just something that happens? Is it intrinsic? Silence in a curatorial context. I'd like to think of curation as an artistic orchestration of productive suggestion, as Allen says. A selective form of residual aura of press content. As she also says, it's the underpinnings of a proclamation of war, violence, displacement, death, with unacknowledged motives. That's what these 2 minutes and 50 seconds stand for Jan Allen in Bush's speech addressing the nation on the war in Iraq. Spectral mechanics are another important part of Jan Allen's speech, and what they are essentially are conditions surrounding exhibition production, and the phrase spectral mechanics is coined by Jan Allen. She mentions the curator's role is one of aesthetic integrity, and curatorship is a series of works in collaboration. Is silence haunting for an exhibition, suffusing it for already being unspoken, or is silence purposeful and motivated? I really can't come to a conclusion unless, I guess every curatorial staff will speak for themselves. Every curation, every exhibition will speak for itself, by and large, because the curator shouldn't have such a voice to overpower the actual exhibition. The next talk I listened to was Anne-Marie Minac's Towards a More Ethical Curatorial Practice, again July 16th, 2005 in Banff. Hers was in French, her speech, and she considers herself more of a commissaire and less of a conservateur. From my understanding, a commissaire is a curator, whereas a conservateur is more of a conserver. But these can be used interchangeably in French on occasion, so I'm not entirely sure what her angle was. I had a bit of a difficult time picking it up. She speaks very nicely, not blocking her face, no computer in front of her, and there's a great translation button, so that's also fantastic. I'm not overly critical of this speaker. I agree with a lot of what she says. I think objectivity is necessary in a museum worker's code of ethics. However, is pure objectivity ever going to be achieved? I don't necessarily think so. It's pure anything is hard to achieve. Pure honesty, pure virtues, and I especially think that being purely objective is something that's really, really difficult unless you're dealing with subjects like mathematics or science, where the answer is a set answer and there's no room for wiggling around. When it comes to something as subjective as art exhibitions and the maintenance of interesting artifacts, it's very important that the curator attempt to maintain objectivity, but I really don't think it's possible to be completely 100% objective when you're dealing with such subjective matter. I do think it is necessary in the museum workers' code of ethics, though, because if we just turn around and say that it's not important to be objective and subjectively place anything your aesthetic eye really wants to, then I think we're turning the whole infrastructure on its head, and you definitely need to have a sense of objectivity or authority of judgment when it comes to curating. I do believe that there can be a star curator, which Ninax agrees with. It's her assertion that this person is narcissistic and it's a globe-trotting job, but I do believe that there are star curators, just like there are star artists or star athletes. I do believe that there are people who just have a natural eye for doing curation, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. I think some people have a naturally very pleasing aesthetic, and they're very well able to put things in places that look aesthetically pleasing to most. And I think they're just born with this natural knack, like some people are born to play basketball, or some people are born to be writers, whereas others are born into mathematics. I understand that with practice, a lot of practice, anybody can become good at these things, such as mathematics. I could become good at, quadratic equations. If I really tried, I'm sure I could, but it's not really piquing my interest. This does, though, and I believe that I'm one of those people that does have an eye for setting things up, if I do say so myself. But I don't profess to be absolutely perfect at this, and I do think objectivity is important, because if it were a purely subjective matter, then I might just put out what I wanted to see in an art exhibition or what have you. So I think there needs to be a little push and pull between myself and, say, someone whose artwork I'm exhibiting or whose collection of interesting artifacts I'm showing. The last speaker I listened to was, I believe it's pronounced Sandra Eden. It's spelled with an X, and it's entitled "Curators Are So Over," from the same conference in Banff, July 16, 2005, where she argues curating is controversial in modern art or contemporary art. But I would agree with that and say that curating or anything in modern art or contemporary art strives to make everything controversial. Every contemporary art in and of itself is controversial, and if it's not, then it's not worthy of people's time nowadays. It's all been done, so the more controversial something, the better. So as far as I'm concerned, that statement in and of itself doesn't make a lot of sense, because, like I mentioned, modern art is already controversial, and if modern artists can strive to make something more controversial, I feel like they will. Damien Hirst probably will agree with me. I couldn't get him for contact today, though. I couldn't reach him for comment. So, is the authority definition of the term curator is a cause for disagreement among many. There's less emphasis on reading, writing, and researching, and more time with administrative duties and fundraising. And this is asserted by Sandra Eden. So I agree with her that change happens. There are fewer jobs in curation that have an emphasis on reading, writing, and researching, and of course there's more time with administrative duties and fundraising, because people are only going to come to exhibits that are well advertised, so that's where the fundraising can come in and put it in a decent place, a nice venue, maybe some food and wine. There has to be fundraising done, and administrative duties shouldn't just be left to administrators anymore. I think everyone should get a foot in the door, because it seems more practical, and multimodal communication is extremely important to museums, the infrastructure of museums. Sandra Eden also talks about the salons in Paris. I find this very interesting. In my undergraduate, we talked about the salons in Paris as well. And your work was skied if you didn't know the right people, basically. So when Eden poses the question, is there a system of accreditation and a hierarchy based on knowledge in place for curators? I would say, of course, there is. There's a hierarchy for everything. There's a hierarchy of knowledge, placing science and mathematics at the top with doctors, and there's a hierarchy